Welcome to another Kairos video about preaching unbelief. My name is Borchers, and I'm going to be sharing with you today about engaging a questioning culture. My wife and I have planted the Feast Church in Providence, Rhode Island. Our city is one with many universities and a culture in which intellectual discourse happens all the time about philosophy, politics, culture, and other things. One of the core values of our church has always been dialogue. We think that people best hear the gospel when they can talk about it with believers who appreciate conversations and questions. In this video, we're going to focus on the ways that you can better engage in a questioning culture in your preaching. Often, we make the mistake of thinking that non-Christian people are completely disinterested in religion or spirituality. The truth is that often our non-Christian friends are more turned off by our communication style than the ideas that we're communicating. Instead of listening to a lecture, many of our friends want to be able to ask their questions and have them meaningfully engaged. To address this challenge, we're going to talk today about creating a question-friendly culture at your church, particularly in your preaching. There is a reason that I've used the phrase culture when I talk about a question-friendly culture. Some of the misgivings that visitors have about our churches are not strictly speaking a matter of the content we share. Instead, many of them feel a certain vibe or feeling or culture when they enter our buildings. That culture can often feel like it's arrogant to them. We put ourselves up as the religious experts who are going to impart onto ignorant minds the truth of the gospel. While at some points in history, and even in some places today, people flock to churches to hear from authority figures, many more people in modern America want to engage in a community of equals and co-learners. This is why we talk more in modern circles about a journey towards faith with people. Creating an environment where questions are expected, welcomed, and celebrated is an appropriate missional strategy for American Christians today. So how do we go about this? Isn't a sermon necessarily a monologue? Wouldn't it be chaos if we were to open up to questions? Many of us have misgivings about being truly open to questions in our Sunday morning contexts. I want to walk you through 3 ways that you might begin to create a culture that is more open to questions. Hopefully these ideas will be easy for you to implement. Remember that while engaging actual conversations is important, during your first contact with a visitor, they often are not looking to have the actual conversation, but to see if you're open to conversations more than anything else. The first way I'd encourage you to engage in a questioning culture is to offer what I call apologetic asides. Basically, as a preacher, you look for the places in your sermon where you will say something that is difficult for non-Christians to believe. What content in your sermon might cause someone to think, that's impossible? Once you have identified one of these challenges to belief, it is important to take a few minutes in your sermon, ideally 2 to 5, and respond to the concern directly in the presentation. This communicates to your skeptic that instead of glossing over major logical challenges, which they are faced with, you are willing to engage in them instead. You are not aloof from the faith challenges of average people, and you're willing to speak to them in the context of your sermon. Giving voice to common concerns communicates to the church that these concerns are normal and acceptable. Here's one issue that commonly prompts an apologetic aside from me as I preach: demon possession. Frequently in the Gospels, Jesus will heal someone who has a demon, and I know that our non-Christian friends see these stories as old fairy tales. Demons are not real entities to them. So I might say something like this. Now I want to take a moment to talk to you about demon possession. I know many of you are probably skeptical about what's going on in this passage. Certainly, some of the behaviors that Scripture talks to us about as demon possession, in modern contexts, we might think of as a significant psychological disorder or even a medical condition like epilepsy. Should we take these texts seriously since they're talking about pre-scientific explanations for such behavior? First of all, let's say for the sake of argument that some of the demon possession in the New Testament is in fact mental illness. The main thrust of the text, that Jesus can heal someone who's very sick, doesn't change. Modern psychologists can attest to how difficult treatment of such conditions are. So we will see how Jesus can change lives one way or the other. Furthermore, Our medical and health professionals amongst us will tell you that health challenges are rarely simply a physical or mental issue or something that can be segregated into one category or the other. Instead, we find often that our psychological, emotional, physical, and even spiritual health are intricately connected. Might it be that while the Gospels focus on the spiritual parts of someone's suffering, calling it demon possession, and modern science might refer to it as a physical or brain chemical issue, that the reality is that there is a complex mixture of all those things at once? We want to be cautious as well that we don't become culturally patronizing in our approach to these texts. It is easy for modern Western European heritage people to look down on the way people from other times and other places look at subjects including disease and demon possession. But that doesn't mean that we want to be guilty of this sort of elitism where we mock someone else's culture and their understanding of what's going on. I'm sure for some of you, this doesn't fix things. I'm not able to get rid of all the concerns you have about this text. But I'd hope that we could at least consider these possibilities and how we maybe understand demon possession in light of what we know today, and then continue on with the text to see the way God can manufacture an incredible change in someone's life. That's how I would handle an issue like that. Now note, I didn't take that much time, but it did honor the doubts and the questions that non-Christians might have. It addressed them and let them know that they're not crazy for asking them and that they're actually welcomed in our meeting place. I want to take one moment to remind you that our biggest visitor Sundays are often also the Sundays where we need apologetic asides. Almost any Christmas sermon is going to have to acknowledge the virgin birth and how that bothers us with our knowledge of how biology works. Similarly, if someone visits at Easter and they're not a believer, there's probably going to be some concern on their part about resurrection, whether scientifically or historically, and what it means and why we believe it. And it would be really appropriate to provide an apologetic aside on those subjects. The second way I'd encourage you to engage a questioning culture is to share both sides of a controversial issue in the text of your sermon. From time to time, we all come to a text that brings up an old, long-debated theological problem. We often feel as a preacher that it's our job to tell people what position is the right one. The problem is that the person in our pew is often aware of these tensions, and when they see us make light of it or even ignore it, the result is that they distrust us. They don't think that we're showing them the whole story. Acknowledging the elephant in the room gives you credibility. It also lets your listener engage in some critical thinking of their own. All of these benefits can be accentuated when the preacher can refrain from being too strong and giving an authoritative answer at the end of the discussion to make sure everyone comes out with the quote-unquote right idea about what's going on. Some classic examples of this kind of issue might be grace versus works, or free will versus determinism. Let's say that while I'm preaching on the Great Commission and how essential I think it is that we share the gospel, I might say something along these lines to address a problem that might be in the text. Now, obviously, the importance I'm placing today on sharing our faith assumes that people choose to be part of God's people. Some of you have familiarity with theological systems that emphasize grace in such a way that people are saved regardless of any human effort or decision. God ordains who will be and will not be his people. If one believes that, then the forces of these passages might be different. Personally, I've always believed that Scripture upholds the beauty of one choosing to become a member of God's people. But I realize that this tension is one that's been in the church for a long time. And given that tension, we have to understand that our approach to that issue is going to change how maybe we read this text. It would be my encouragement to you to not allow your opinion on it to overwhelm the overall thrust of what Matthew is trying to tell us here in the Great Commission, that Jesus desires for us to be engaged in the lives of people all around the world to help encourage them to be better disciples. Again, note that this wasn't a long excursion into other territory, but it acknowledged something that might be in the back of the mind of a doubtful person in the room. A few other examples of these kinds of issues that we approach in our sermons might be pacifism versus just war theory, or political activity versus non-activity, or the exact nature of the Lord's Supper, or a whole variety of other things. My general rule of thumb is that if it is an opinion that millions of Christians have been on both sides of for hundreds of years, it's probably something that's worth more context than merely me stating my opinion on it. Allowing some room for those things to breathe helps people to feel like they're being encouraged to think, not just to swallow whatever doctrinal pill you're trying to force down their throats. The third thing that I personally endorse as a positive way to engage a questioning culture is to literally engage a questioning culture. Have a Q&A time at the end of your sermons. For many of us, this is terrifying. We've done so much research and work to make sure that we're prepared to talk about what we're going to talk about in the sermon, that being prepared to talk about other questions just really makes us scared. While that task may seem daunting, I've been doing it for years at the end of my sermons. In fact, about 5 years since we've launched. And I have a few suggestions on ways that you can do this and make it a fruitful time for your church. One obvious challenge is the format. Our church plant has been small enough that we've allowed people to just raise their hand and ask a question from their seat. A similar system where you set up a microphone to take questions at one side of the building is another way to do this kind of questions. It might be untenable if you have a larger group, but I've seen that work with groups of hundreds and hundreds of people, from university lectures to comic conventions. Recently, we've gone to trying cards, where people can write their questions on the card and then hand them in. I then have a chance to read through them and come back up and do the Q&A via the question cards. Those mechanics are a little bit slower. Other options might include using technology. Some churches will use a Twitter hashtag or a texting phone number where someone can send in their question digitally. Then there's a team member at the back at the AV system who's able to comb through the questions and then throw them up on a screen, for example. Some of those later options are great in that they prevent mini sermons being disguised as questions. And sometimes I've seen those disguises be almost non-existent. As far as handling questions goes, you're far more prepared than you think. You might have a really sharp individual in your church that asks really hard questions and makes it difficult. But my experience is that most of the questions we get are relatively garden variety questions we get all the time in Bible studies. People ask things like, why do bad things happen to good people? Or how can I love unlovable people? Or where do we get that from in the Bible? Or do you think Jesus really meant what he said in this verse? Or maybe this was in the Old Testament. Do we still have to do it? I don't mean to belittle those questions. They're important and good. I'm just letting you know as a preacher that you've heard those before, and you probably have a stock answer of how you deal with those sorts of things based on your experience of leading Bible studies. Furthermore, it's always great to say, that's such a good question, I don't know the answer to it right now. Let me research it and we can talk about it next week. Or even better yet, let's set up a time where you and I can study that together. Showing an openness to questions is not the same as saying that you know all the answers all the time. Before I close, I do want to point out an underlying issue that can help or hinder everything that I've said so far. As a preacher, you need to be committed to conversations with non-Christians. That commitment means a toughness where you can read and understand criticism of Christianity even when they hurt your feelings. On social media, we're all exposed to rude or unkind people who rip down the church. While that can be uncomfortable, we have to be able to at least hear and analyze those criticisms, even when they aren't fair. We might want to simply ignore criticism, but our non-Christian friends will not. That means that we need to be committed to having non-Christian friends and engaging them on topics of faith, science, politics, etc. They are an important helper to us in being able to be more empathetic and understanding. Most of all, we have to have a spirit that embraces people who think differently than we do. Sometimes we seem aloof or arrogant in our preaching precisely because we think we're smarter or more informed than the people that disagree with us. The humility to truly listen must be cultivated in all areas of our lives. I've laid out 3 ways that you can engage a questioning culture better in your preaching. I realize that for many of you, your current setting may make a full Q&A really hard to implement. But that could be a long-term goal. That's okay. For practical exercise, let me encourage you to make a decision today that you will try one of these techniques. Consider your upcoming sermon series and the text that you have before you. What is one particular concern that might come up in the mind of a non-believer in the sermons that you're about to preach? Is there a contentious issue that's been debated in the history of the church, which will distract people as they think about it while you're trying to go through a sermon? Decide today what that particular problem or issue is, and then start to build an apologetic aside or one of our controversy descriptions that we talked about, and put that into the sermon. I pray God's blessings on you as you try to continue to think about how we better preach to unbelief so that more and more of our friends might know the goodness of being in a relationship with Jesus Christ. Blessings.